Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. Here's what we have coming up today. The top 1% of Americans are living it up, while the bottom 99% continue to struggle to make ends meet. We'll tell you why the Republican Party thinks that the 1%ers are the ones who need government handouts. And the fossil fuel industry has put their money to use, funding bogus studies on the effects of their pollution. Investigative journalist Steve Horn will bring us the details. And is a true progressive movement beginning to take shape in America? A string of recent political victories shows that the days of the Reagan Republicans and the Clinton Democrats could quickly be coming to an end. We have all that and more coming up, and right now, you've just stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
Last week, Republican Congressman Andy Harris from Massachusetts told CNN that if we cut the National Food Stamp Program, it would actually translate into more money for the hungry. Harris made that claim while defending his party's plans to cut $40 billion from the food stamp program that currently provides assistance to about 46 million American citizens. Harris's argument is that there is so much fraud taking place in the food stamp program that cutting the amount given will reduce that fraud, thereby leaving more money for food for the needy. This argument is completely not true, but it's one that Republicans love to use to demonize social programs. They pull out that fraud boogeyman every chance they get. Republicans like Harris say that the fraud rate for food stamps is 10%, when in reality it's close to about 3% and falling. But this issue really has nothing to do with food stamps or fraud. It's about the continued attack on the poor. The Republican Party has become a heartless, soulless entity that could not care less about the 50 million Americans who go hungry every day, or the 11 million people who can't find a job, or the 48 million Americans who currently have no health insurance coverage at all. The Republicans have fought and continue to fight every single effort aimed at helping the less fortunate. So we end up with higher poverty rates, higher infant mortality rates, and higher rates of cancer than the rest of the industrialized world, and all of these problems could be fixed, but the Republican Party says no. But at the same time, they have absolutely no problem extending a helping hand to the people at the top of the income ladder in the form of tax breaks, corporate subsidies, and political favors. The top 1% of our income earners are doing just fine, but Republicans are making sure that they get every benefit our government has to offer. If the Republicans really want to rein in government handouts, then they should look at their campaign donors, because even though they aren't struggling, even though they aren't going hungry, and even though they don't need it, the top 1% of income earners are sucking trillions of dollars from our government in the form of corporate welfare every year. Joining me now to talk about the corporate welfare being handed out to the 1% is attorney Howard Nations. Howard, we've got Republicans in Washington that are doing everything they can to stop any kind of safety net program for the poor. But at the same time, they don't even make a peep when they hear that we're giving $1 trillion in the form of subsidies and tax breaks to the top 1% of earners. Why is that? Why is there a difference between helping those who need it and giving $1 trillion to those who don't?
Well, primarily because the $1 trillion goes to the people, the wealthiest people in the country, who have lobbyists. They have direct contact with congressmen. They have the pipeline that can get them the tax breaks they need. Whereas the poor, who are supposed to be represented by Congress, are totally unrepresented in Washington. It's a ridiculous situation that's just simply getting worse in every session. At this time we have the best money that we have. At this time we have the best Congress that money can buy.
It is, and of course that always turns out to be horrible for those in need. You know, right now they're on this kick that they want to dismantle health care, which is, you know, hopefully going to provide insurance for, you know, the 48 million Americans who currently don't have it. But, you know, I think obviously, you know, we've discussed what's happening, you know, to the bottom 99% quite a bit. But I think it's staggering the fact that we're giving, hundreds of billions of dollars, and some estimates say, as close to $1 trillion every year to those who don't need it. And a lot of that, we give billions every year in the form of tax breaks and subsidies to the oil industry, and they're making, $20 to $40 billion a year apiece. Have you seen some of these numbers? I mean, what's going on here?
Well, what's going on is this. We have two classes in this country. We have the super rich and we have the rest of us. And the super rich are putting money away faster than they can even keep up with it. And they're buying more and more influence in Congress as they go. The fact is that the super rich have the influence in Congress to get individual tax bills passed, to get every kind of tax bill there is. They talk about the deficit all the time, and this is supposedly being done to control the deficit. The fact of the matter is that there are two ways to control the deficit. One is by reducing government spending. The other is by increasing government income. The way to increase government income is through taxation. Yet, reducing government spending is the route they choose. And since the sequester debacle, we've lost 900,000 jobs. We're going to lose 1.6 million through 2014. They've reduced food stamps for the hungry, aid for orphan children, Head Start programs for the poor children, and they've just attacked the elderly left and right on entitlements. And now they're trying to force yet another debt crisis on us, which actually doesn't exist, because the fact is the deficit is $640 billion. It's reduced by more than 50% since Bush left office. And this is the fastest reduction of deficit since World War II. Yet the cry is we've got to cut entitlements, we've got to cut jobs, and it's a big lie. It's a very big lie.
Well, the fact is, too, if you were to ask Americans how having a high deficit affects them, they don't know. They can't answer that. The deficit is just this giant boogeyman used by the Republicans to scare people. And at the same time, they want us to forget that they're the ones who ran it up so high. I mean, let's not forget when Bush came into office, there was a projected surplus because Clinton wasn't afraid to, raise some tax rates. And corporate profits still went through the roof. I mean, they understand that, you can pay more to the government, but paying more to the government translates into the government spending more. That translates into, money for the needy, which gets spent, which helps it. It's a cycle that perpetuates itself in a good way. But right now we have a cycle where the wealthy 1% give money to Congress to give them more money, which gives them more money to give money back to Congress. So we're in the wrong cycle right now. And I don't know how we break that. I don't know how we overcome this, flood of corporate money that in coming months could actually get much worse.
Well, it is getting much worse. A report just came out from the National Priorities Project saying that there will be $1 trillion in tax benefits in 2013, mostly going to the wealthy. That could be, if they're so concerned about the deficit, you could be collecting a large portion of that money and applying it to the deficit. The deficit is $640 billion. They're talking about $1 trillion in the tax benefits in this year alone. The Congressional Budget Office says 10 major tax breaks totaling more than $750 billion in tax savings will take place in 2013, and which obviously heavily favor the top income earners. 127 billion of it is going to the top 1%. But listen to this one. Among the upper 1%, there are 1.2 million people in the upper 1% who will pay no taxes this year. None. That's absurd.
That is absolutely unbelievable. But again, as we've talked about, that's not an accident. That is the result of their, $1 million lobbyists, their $1 million PR scams, these super PACs that they create. This is the result. This is the post-Citizens United America. And with this upcoming McCutcheon case before the Supreme Court, we could be looking at a country where the bottom 99% don't have a say at all. I mean, arguably they don't have a say now, but things are likely to get a lot worse before they get better. And later on in the show, we're going to be talking about this populist uprising that appears to be happening. It toppled Larry Summers. It toppled this whole Syrian war that we almost started. Real quick, do you think that the situation will get worse before it gets better, or do you think there's a movement to make things right now?
Well, the situation is going to get worse before it gets better, because right now there's a lot of money being spent to perpetuate the lie that we have an emergency deficit situation that has to be controlled by cutting benefits, cutting entitlements. And this entire thing is not happening by chance. It's a massively funded PR campaign. It's designed to convince people of these lies. An outfit called Fix the Debt is spending $60 million to create the deficit emergency situation lie in order to get government cut. A Wall Street billionaire named Pete Peterson spending $1 billion to convince people that there's a big deficit emergency and we need to cut the size of government. The only thing that's going to stop it, Farron, is going to be what happened in the last election. You're going to have the public stand up and vote against the people like the Koch brothers, who put $250 million into the last election, the Sunlight Foundation, who's 1% of the top 1%, who funded a large portion of the election, Karl Rove and his group. That whole group together put $500 million into the election, and as a result of the public's perception of what they were doing, they elected virtually no one. They lost almost all their money. They lost almost all their investment, and that's what's going to have to happen. It's going to have to be the public standing up and recognizing who's being supported by these big billionaires who are trying to buy elections and voting against them. That's going to have to happen, because it's for sure the Congress that they're supporting with their big contributions is going to do nothing about it.
Well, the public is going to have their chance again in 13 months in the 2014 midterm election, so let's hope they stand up.
You're absolutely right.
Howard, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Farron.
Coming up, we'll be taking a look at the funding behind a recent study that says that fracking isn't all that bad for the environment. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
Hi, I'm Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire on Free Speech TV. The corporate-controlled media rakes in millions of dollars in profit every year by only telling you half of the story. They're at the mercy of their corporate sponsors, and they refuse to take on corporations that kill, maim, and harm consumers. Here at Free Speech TV, we don't have shareholders. We don't answer to corporate America, and we don't pull any punches. Our loyalty is to the viewers, and our viewers are the ones that help keep Free Speech TV alive. Free Speech TV doesn't take corporate money, and that's why your financial support is so important to us. Viewer voices, not corporate sponsors, fuel Free Speech TV and drive many of our programming decisions. You can help protect Free Speech TV with your donation. Free Speech TV airs independent news and views for independent thinkers like you. Our people-powered programs demonstrate what's possible in our democracy when we unite as workers, as students, as artists, as parents, and partners in progress. More people means more power. Each donation brings more power in programs and more possibilities for change. Our programming equips viewers with vital tools, resources, contacts, and examples of how to collectively build alternative, sustainable solutions to serious community problems. Please donate now and bring these organizing tools into your community. Everyone should have access to news and information that's forming the world around them. Our goal is to keep you and everybody involved. We aim to reach every viewer possible because we're all in this together. Go online to freespeech.org and help support independent, honest news journalism. Your support helps keep information flowing and together we can hold the corporate media more accountable.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. The natural gas industry has been trying to convince the American public for years that fracking is safe. The public has been slow to accept the industry's claim, so they've taken it a step further and started paying for skewed research to prove their point. Joining me now to discuss this is investigative journalist Steve Horn. Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So first off, there was a recent study by the Environmental Defense Fund that came out and said that fracking is not so bad. Tell us about that study a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to contextualize sort of when the study took place and why it took place. And this is now over 2 years after the big Cornell University study came out in April 2011, the first big one to really say that, fracking is really harmful to the climate. The first one that really said that fugitive methane emissions can lead to climate catastrophe from fracking. Methane is actually a greenhouse gas, and in its first 20 years in the atmosphere is 105 times more potent than CO2. So the study at Cornell by Bob Howarth and Anthony Ingraffia really got the ball rolling on lots of further research, more investigations on whether or not their claims were true. And all non-industry funded research on this topic has verified their claims and sometimes even shown that what they found is worse. Basically,
So we do have plenty of academic research out there that shows that the methane that's being released into the atmosphere from fracking is harmful. Some
Right.
studies say it's worse than the other ones, but this first initial Cornell study that was done back in 2011 said, look, this is very bad for the environment. It's very bad for people. Something has to be done. And so
right.
Recently, as your investigations have shown, there was this Environmental Defense Fund study that came out that kind of turned all that on its head. But you dug a little deeper and you found out that it was not just the Environmental Defense Fund running this. Who was really behind this latest study?
Right, and so that's an important point. So their findings were, the methane emissions were 2 to 4% lower, by totality of the methane that it is in the gas, what gets emitted into the air, than the Cornell study. And so it's important to look at the people and the money behind the study, as I did. And you look at sort of the acknowledgement section of the report and you see that ExxonMobil is a key funder, Chevron's a key funder, and then a lot of key individuals who have huge investments in hedge funds in the natural gas industry. People like Julian Robertson through his Tiger Infrastructure Partners, which owns TKT Midstream, which owns lots of pipeline assets and downstream type of assets such as liquefied natural gas export terminals. So you look at sort of what was happening behind the scenes, then you see, so these studies, you have to take that all with a grain of salt. And so then the question is, there's industry funding, but what were the findings sound? And then that's the question that I answered with that is I looked at what, going back to Tony Ingraffia and Bob Howarth at Cornell, who said that, for two main reasons, these findings are very flawed. And I think it ties right into the people and the money behind the study. And that's, number one, they were only allowed onto production sites that the industry allowed them to be at the time of day that the industry wanted them there, because that's who funded the study. And this is they'll make the claim that this is the first ever study where we're allowed on site to do these measurements. But the point is that, you were allowed on site when the industry wanted you there at a time where they may have been doing things a little more effectively. Maybe it actually does show that they're capable of doing it, but it doesn't really prove that they always do it. It might prove that maybe they only did it for the study. Maybe they only do it sometimes. Maybe this is
the industry themselves. not only were they, on this board that's doing this study, their money is pushing it, but they were also allowed to pick the sites, the times, all of the circumstances that they wanted for these researchers to go out and test these sites. I mean, doesn't that give them plenty of time to do cleanup, to do whatever? So it's this Potemkin village of a fracking site. It's not real, basically. They've already gone in and they've cleaned it up.
Yeah, the parallel that I make is it's kind of like going embedded with soldiers, if you're the media, to Iraq or Afghanistan, and you see a certain version of Iraq and Afghanistan. If you're embedded, you see the Pentagon's version. But if you do something like what Jeremy Scahill does, where he goes unembedded, he sees a completely different version of the wars. And I feel like this is a pretty good parallel. You see a completely different version of what's going on at fracking sites when the industry is guiding you through the whole thing and letting you see what they want you to see at the time of the day, time of the week that they want you to be there. So that's really key. And then that goes right to number 2, and that's that they only looked at 190 production sites, which may sound like a lot at face value, but there are 8,000 production sites in the United States of America alone. So statistically, 190 out of 8,000 is not enough of not a broad enough sample to really say that these findings are definitive. If anything, there could be very much a selection bias in the sites they're allowed to go at. So I feel like those two are tied together, and I think they both tie into who funded the study. And it's all not necessary, as Howarth and Graffia pointed out, because researchers don't need industry compliance to do these measurements. Although it'd be great if they could get on site without the industry's permission, but they can't. But there's other ways to skin the cat. And the big one is that you can do flyovers, and that's been done in big studies where you can capture what kind of methane is being emitted into the air from above, and you don't need industry compliance. And those findings have been find things that are way worse than this study, which, as they say, almost seems as if it's ho-hum. We have nothing to worry about with fracking, but that's not the case based on all the non-industry funded studies.
So basically the bottom line is, if you're going to read a study that talks about fracking, make sure you know who's paying for it and who they work for. Steve Horn,
all the money.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Steve Horn is a research fellow at dsmogblog.com. Portions of the Affordable Care Act will begin to take effect very soon, and the same people who helped draft the bill are already lining their pockets thanks to their inside knowledge of the law. Joining me now to talk about this is attorney David TeSelle. So David, once again, we've got this revolving door scenario playing out with this healthcare law. We've seen it so many times with this and other situations. What's happening in Washington now?
What we've got going on in Washington right now is we've got people who worked in the government, who worked in the White House, who worked in Congress, who learned and put together this labyrinth of a healthcare law, who are now leaving the government and going into the private sector to profit off of the work that they did when working for the American taxpayer.
So these are people, they actually helped create this law. They wrote portions of it, they understand it better than anybody else, and they know the loopholes. They know how to, make a quick buck off this, and that's what we're seeing.
And this is the real problem, and this is a significant problem that the President Obama, when he was running for office in 2007 and 2008, one of the first things he said that he would do would be to close the revolving door in Washington. The problem that you have is you have the same people who are creating the laws that are going to regulate an industry, whether it's on Wall Street or whether here it's the Health Care Act with Obamacare, who are then, after they create that law, going out into the private sector and being able to tell the companies that they're working for, who are paying them large, lavish salaries, how to get around that law. And that's a problem. I mean, that's not what we hire our elected officials, or elect our officials, and then have the people that work for them. That's not what we sign up for as the American taxpayer. And when the president was running in 2007, 2008, he said he would stop that. Where is that, President Obama? I think that's the one that we all want to be in place, not the one we have right now.
Exactly. I think a lot of people would like to see the 2007, 2008 Obama back in office. Unfortunately, he's gotten in there, and it's turned into a lot of what we saw during the Bush administration. Bush allowed people to come in from Pfizer and help run the FDA. I mean,
Absolutely.
and now with this healthcare law, you know, a large portion of this law, when they were drafting it, they brought in pharmaceutical executives, insurance executives, and these people crafted this to their benefit. You know, that's why, as part of it, we're not allowed to negotiate drug prices. That the pharmaceutical industry took that right out. And now, even worse, is we have these people who worked side by side with industry. You know, they became good friends. You know, I'm sure they had many late nights, you know, ordering pizza, drafting this healthcare law. And that's the problem, is that we as taxpayers funded this. We paid for this. And now they're taking this knowledge that we paid for, and they're using it, and they're making millions, aren't they? I mean, they're getting these huge exorbitant salaries.
This is incredible. I don't think that the American people, when we talk about numbers, a lot of times, I think the numbers kind of go over people's heads. But the healthcare industry last year alone spent over $243 million on lobbying. That, according to the Center for Responsible Politics. These are real numbers, and these are amounts that are being paid so that they can avoid or get around or find the loopholes in the very bills that are supposed to be in place to protect us from this new health care law. I mean, one of the things, to get to your point, I mean, think about the fact that the people that are putting these together in late nights are actually profiting from making a complex, opaque a bill and an act and a law that people can't understand, so that they have to be hired to interpret it for them. I mean, we have people like Dr. Dora Hughes from the Department of Health and Human Services, who worked as Kathleen Sebelius's counselor, who goes to Sidley Austin. She's not a lawyer. She's someone who's a doctor, but she's now working at a law firm, a prominent lobbying law firm, making a large amount of money as a quote-unquote strategic advisor, so she doesn't violate the ethics pledge that she's supposed to follow of not becoming a lobbyist. I mean, this is the game that's going on in Wall Street, and this needs to stop.
Well, you just pointed out exactly the problem, is that this has become so horrible that they have to actually make these pledges and say, look, I will not go and become a lobbyist. But again, they're still the ones who draft those rules that say that I won't become a lobbyist, but I know how to get around that. You know, I know that I can go work for Merck, you know, because we've included this provision that we can't negotiate drug prices. I did that for them. They're going to pay me back. I scratch their back, they scratch mine. And that's what's happening all over the place. If this was Wall Street, we would almost consider this insider trading.
Absolutely. I mean, and the problem, the big problem that we've got, is we have a culture in Washington that actually pushes this, it creates it, and it sustains it. We have people who go to Wall Street, I mean, to Washington after being in college or coming out of grad school, and they go in and work on these bills. They get this specialized knowledge, and then they decide, you know, I'd really like to make money, and I'd like to settle down, and I'd like to get out there and profit for myself. But what's being lost here is really what I call the fiduciary duty that you have to the American people, to the voter and the taxpayer, when you work for the government, to not profit off of the things that you learn when you work for us, for yourself personally. That has to stop.
It does, absolutely. David TeSelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll take a look at the many problems with electronic voting machines and how they could steal yet another election. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins, and for Mike Papantonio this week. There's been a lot of talk recently about voting rights as Republicans are attempting to send America back to the Jim Crow era. But missing from our talks on voting is the problem of electronic voting machines. And I'm joined now by investigative journalist Brad Friedman to give us an update on what's happening in the world of electronic voting. Brad, I remember after the 2004 election when we ran into so many problems with electronic voting machines, you know, there was this huge public outcry, mostly from the left, to say that something needs to be done. But then 2008 rolls around, we win, and all of a sudden it almost, you know, kind of disappeared from most of the public's mind. But these machines are still out there. They're still causing a lot of problems. You know, what's going on these days in the world of electronic voting?
Well, I'm both happy and sad to say nothing and a lot, at least out here in Los Angeles County. Nothing in much of the rest of the country, because You're right. We are still using these same machines, these same 100% unverifiable voting machines. There's been so much attention placed, sort of understandably, on voting rights and the ability for Americans to be able to cast their vote at all, that the concerns about electronic voting system and secret counting, which we have all over the country, that has sort of fallen away, and people aren't paying attention to that. It's usually the thing they don't pay attention to until after it's too late, until after the results are already in and people are questioning them. Meanwhile, out here in Los Angeles, the largest voting jurisdiction in the nation, by the way, larger than 36 different complete full states, they're actually developing a new electronic voting system, which will be, if they go ahead with the designs they're planning, this space-aged, 100% unverifiable touchscreen voting system. And to make matters worse, they're planning to sell it to other counties in the state and other states around the country. So this is very much under the radar. This is very troubling and very concerning. And just to make matters worse, a whole bunch of people are trying to move us towards internet voting just because the systems we have now aren't screwed up and unverifiable enough, apparently.
Right, yeah, because nothing bad ever happens when trying to do anything on the internet.
Yeah, that's right. It's a secure platform. We needn't worry.
Well, you know, when you say unverifiable, we're talking about voting machines that they're not going to give you any kind of paper receipt. There's no way to check that the person you voted for, that it's registered. You know, and these are machines, as I know you've been talking about for years now, these can be hacked. You know, the cards that store the votes can be stolen or otherwise changed. And we're still seeing a very strong push for these all over the country. And California appears to be leading the charge in wanting to get these unverifiable voting machines into the polls.
Well, let me be clear. You should never have a receipt when you go to vote, because that leads to vote buying and vote selling. You can, you know, if you're able to walk out of the booth with evidence of how you voted, then people can buy your vote. They can intimidate you. You don't want that. You want hand-marked paper ballots. The problem is that those paper ballots need to be counted, and they need to be counted in a way that the citizens can make sure they're being counted accurately. So this new system in Los Angeles that they're talking about will be a touchscreen system, but it will print out a paper ballot. Now, whether that paper ballot has been printed out correctly or incorrectly, no one can ever know after the election. For example, a couple of years ago, out here in LA in 2008, I used a similar system that they have set up for disabled people. I thought I would test it out. It's actually mostly for blind people. And in fact, that system, that computer, printed out 4 of my 12 votes incorrectly. The computer voted for 4 people that I did not vote for. Now remember, that was a system made for the blind. So most of those people who would have used that system wouldn't have been able to check it. That's the type of system now they want for all voters. And all voters, as we have learned from studies, MIT Caltech, for example, says that 80% of voters don't check their computer-printed paper receipts. A Rice University study finds that of those who do look at their summary at the end of voting, that when it's presented by the computer, 2/3 of them don't notice when the computer has flipped their vote. So if you have a paper ballot that is printed out by the computer, that you can have no way of knowing if that computer-printed paper actually reflects the intent of the voter after an election, it's completely unverifiable. This is the madness that LA County is going towards right now. And to make matters even worse than that, the state of California has just passed a new law, which is waiting on the governor's desk for a signature or a veto, hopefully a veto, but it will end all federal testing of voting systems in the state of California and leave it up to the Secretary of State whether he or she wants to allow new voting systems that haven't even been tested at the state level.
Well, just like with the other voting rights issues coming up, I think this is going to take a grassroots progressive movement to really get out there, make some noise about this issue, and get some change to happen.
Yeah, let me suggest that people, and he could, Governor Jerry Brown could sign this thing anytime. It was passed on a partisan level in the House with very little debate. He could sign it any time, perhaps by the time people see this interview. But please go to gov.ca.gov and let Governor Jerry Brown know that SB 360 is a terrible idea, a dangerous bill, and the idea of less testing for voting machines rather than more is simply madness. But he needs to hear from people. That's SB 360 is the name of the bill, and the place to go is gov.ca.gov, and let him know what you think.
Brad Friedman, founder and editor of bradblog.com. Thank you for being with me today.
Great talking to you, Farron. Thanks a bunch.
All over the country, members of the Tea Party are beating the drums for secession and claiming that they have a legal right to form their own dystopian society. I can't say that I'd miss them, but this kind of thinking presents some obvious problems for America. And I'm joined now by author Joshua Holland to tell us about it. Josh, the Tea Party thinks that they can just up and make their own states or their own countries in areas all over America. What's going on with them?
Yeah, there's a number of conservative rural counties in Maryland, in Colorado, in Michigan, in California that are talking about breaking off and forming their own states. It's kind of a race to be 51. It's a quixotic quest. I mean, you need to have both the approval of the state legislature and then the United States Congress to make that happen, to actually form a new state. But it's an expression of their deep dissatisfaction with what they see as the tyranny of state governments that they don't control.
So, you know, it's not completely unheard of that this could actually happen if they, you know, it's not illegal. There is a process they could go through. Are they actually filing paperwork trying to get this done, or?
Well, yes, a number of counties have held votes, resolutions calling for secession, basically, and this would have to then again go first to the state legislature and get approval there. They don't have. You're right that it's not illegal. They don't have a real chance of it happening for a whole variety of reasons. You know, a lot of these counties are resource rich. The states aren't going to give them up. What we see in Colorado is fight over, you know, it's over gun control, but they're also upset about not being able to frack everywhere. But there is a lot of energy in those counties, and you know, population is important for states. They're going to hold on to it. Then, of course, nobody in the Senate is going to start awarding new senators and watering down their own power. So it's not a serious quest. But I think it's a reflection of a lot of conservative messaging. You know, the conservatives in rural America, if they listen to Rush Limbaugh and watch Fox News, they think that they're, you know, the natural rulers of this country. They think it's a center-right country. They think that the founding fathers were all kind of right-wingers. And they don't see the legitimacy of their democratic governments where they're in the minority. And frankly, a lot of us, you know, I use in the piece that I wrote on BillMoyers.com, I use the example of liberals in Austin, Texas. Well, liberals in Austin, Texas don't have a lot of say over Texas state government. And there's a lot of people in this country in the same position, but they don't feel like they are stuck against a wall or that they have just cause to break off and form their own states.
So as you point out, these are people who've been told by Rush Limbaugh, by Sarah Palin, by Glenn Beck, that they are the real America, that they represent what the founding fathers wanted, you know, what we should all strive to be, are these rural, married white Christian Americans. And they're, you know, you point out again that they're kind of losing touch with the changing demographics of this country in general.
I think that's, you know, that's undergirding this whole effort is a real discomfort with losing their position of privilege. You mentioned white married Christians. That's really the heart of the conservative base. And people are getting married later. They're adopting a new set of cultural values. We're becoming a more diverse country. And it's changing the way states like, for example, Colorado, are being governed. And I think that that's really fueling a lot of this, is this sense of resentment about the changing nature of our society.
And the culture wars, these social issues with same-sex marriage, and that hurts these people. They really are scared of this, aren't they?
I think so. I mean, they've invested in them. The conservative movement has certainly fueled, the politics of grievance within this group for a very, very long time. And as you mentioned, they've been told again and again that they are the real Americans. Now, if you're a minority in a state, if your political preferences aren't being represented, if you're the liberals in Austin, Texas, it's one thing when you think that, you're dealing with other real Americans. But when you're told by the Sarah Palins of the world that you're the real Americans and the other ones are fake Americans, well, if you get inside that mindset, you can see why they would be so disgusted and want to break off and break off with other like-minded people.
I'm still confused as to why they think that breaking off and doing their own thing still in this country is going to help them further their cause at all. I mean, do you think that they really understand what's happening?
Well, look, I mean, we can look at it at the national level, and of course it would not change the tide on issues like gay marriage or other issues that are animating this movement. But if you look at state government, if the 5 very rural conservative counties in Maryland were to break off, they would become a very deep red state. And as it stands, Maryland is quite blue. So I think that in terms of state governance, that's the goal.
Joshua Holland, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Farron.
Joshua Holland is a senior digital producer for BillMoyers.com. And when we come back, we'll tell you how progressives are winning some major battles by working from the bottom up. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins sitting in for Mike Papantonio this week. Things are looking up for the progressive movement as a string of recent political victories can be linked back to grassroots mobilization on their behalf. Is this the dawn of a new progressive era for America? I'm joined now by Shane Farnan, co-host of Talking Left on We Act Radio, to help answer that question. Shane, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Farron. How you doing?
Pretty good. So, Shane, in your opinion, what do you think? I mean, we've had a couple recent victories with Syria, with Larry Summers. Is the progressive movement, from the bottom up kind of gaining some steam here?
I'm not sure. I've read a lot, and I've heard a lot of our friends. Mike has been talking about this, and Tom Hartman has, especially Syria and Larry Summers being big victories for the progressive left. And I do agree that those are victories for the progressive left, but there is another there's another part of this that I think confounds the idea that this is all a progressive movement. While we do agree that these are great outcomes on Syria and Larry Summers, there's another factor in there in that these are things that Obama was for and progressives were against. And because Obama was against these, or were for these two ideas going into Syria, and it was supportive of Larry Summers, there was automatically a built-in right-wing hate machine. No, whatever Obama wants, we don't want. So we had an ally in the far right that made this progressive victories possible. I'm concerned that other progressive ideas would not go as far if we didn't have that unholy alliance with the far right. So I'm not as optimistic about this.
Well, I see one of the things too, with the Keystone XL pipeline. Right. Obama had been a pretty decent supporter of that in the early days, but over the last few years we've had these massive protests, this huge grassroots movement, and to this day the project has not been completely green-lighted by this administration. I see that as probably one of the biggest victories because I know the Republicans are still chomping at the bit to get that thing, in place, by the end of next week if they could.
Yeah, or the end of last week.
Yeah. So I do, I've really typically not an optimistic kind of guy, but I think I am optimistic with the fact that I think progressives in general are starting to figure out that if you want change to happen, if you want to make a difference, you have to do it from the bottom up because we've got a couple of allies in Congress. We do have Elizabeth Warren, we do have Bernie Sanders, and several others, but for the most part, we've got a lot of Democrats and almost all Republicans in there who are going to go with whatever the Wall Street, the oil industry, whatever big business wants to do. So, this bottom-up movement, do you think it could gain steam and we could see some real action on things like minimum wage and,
Wow, minimum wage is a tough one. And the reason that I was speaking before that we had the unholy alliance with the far right, if you look at something like gun control, very grassroots, very progressive, very popular, 80 or so percent, but because we didn't have that alliance on the other side, that I'm going to say no to it because Obama's saying yes. Of course, it didn't go through. Keystone XL, that's a tough one. There again, I'm probably thinking that the Keystone will go through. That one's yet to be determined. Of course, I'd like it to not be approved, but again, that's one of those ones where there's not that extra oomph. I do believe the progressive movement, of course, has to be from the grassroots level, but we've had that extra really loud ally that we didn't really ask for in a lot of these things where we've gotten victories. If we can somehow figure out how to get that political power of that far right and move it into our grassroots movement, then we can do it without them on things in the future. But I think Keystone XL is still yet to be determined.
Well, unfortunately, it's almost impossible to fight back the kind of money that they're putting behind a project like this. But you mentioned this alliance with this unholy alliance with the right, and it is kind of scary when we find ourselves on the same side as these people who, in some areas of the country, they actually want to secede and make their own America. So how do we move forward without this? How do we convince the politicians? We've got the poll numbers, we've got the people out there working for it. What's the next step? How do we achieve a true victory?
Progressive without the far right? Well, the thing is that we're there in the numbers already. The grand issue that's in the way is that we are popular. Our ideas are incredibly popular, but that is not reflected in the outcomes in terms of elections. And of course, there's two reasons for that: unlimited money by corporations into elections, and vote rigging by conservatives who don't want Democrats to vote. If we can fix those two things, and I realize those are two gigantic hurdles to clear, but if those were to be cleared, then the progressive ideas that most people actually hold would come through in our representatives, and our representatives would vote that way. But it's really a core issue: voting and elections.
So we've got about a minute left. What's our best hope in Congress? Who's out there fighting for the ideals that this progressive populist base really believes in?
Oh, wow. A lot of them come to mind. Some of the people you've mentioned: Elizabeth Warren, of course, Sherrod Brown. Ellen Grayson really led the fight, I believe, on Syria, because remember when Syria first came out, it was, well, there's going to be, again, an unholy alliance where it's going to pass the House, or it's going to pass the Senate, no problem, and then it's going to pass the House, probably. And then it's not going to pass the House, and then it's not going to pass the Senate. So people like Ellen Grayson, people who loudly pound the desk for progressive ideas, articulate them well, and get that grassroots activated and excited about the issues.
Shane Farnan, co-host of Talking Left on We Act Radio. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
It was great to be here. Thanks.
Our corporate-controlled Supreme Court has given big business a lot of victories in recent years, but there's still one massive prize waiting to be awarded by the court, and that is the complete dismantling of class action lawsuits. Joining me now to tell us how big business and our courts are taking away the class actions is attorney Matt Edling. Matt, thanks for joining me.
You bet. Thank you, Farron.
So, I was going to say, we've had a couple rulings in the last 2 years that are slowly trying to chip away at the ability of people to form these class action lawsuits. Tell us about some of those recent cases we've had.
Sure. Over the last couple of years, we've had about 4 or 5 class action cases that have been before the Supreme Court. And pretty uniformly, they've come out pro-business and anti-consumer. And even the one case that you would say is a pro-consumer ruling, which would be the 2011 Halliburton decision, was quickly followed by the 2013 Amgen decision, where the Supreme Court said, okay, yes, you investors, you can get a class certified for your investment losses due to some fraudulent misstatements. But, and this was a dissent, we are telling you now that if the right case comes before us, your ability to certify a securities class action may be forever gone and off the table. And the reason is the Supreme Court says the economic theory that all securities class actions have based their ability to certify a class on, we, the Supreme Court, think is probably not correct anymore. And we want to take a look at a 25-year-old decision that we, the Supreme Court, issued called Basic v. Levinson. So, fast forward just a couple days ago, the same company, Halliburton, that was before the Supreme Court in 2011 that lost on a particular issue is petitioning for a writ of certiorari right now to say, hey, Supreme Court, we read your dissent just a couple weeks ago. We'd like you to take a look at that issue. We think we're the right case, we're the right business to pretty much end securities class actions. And that obviously would have a very detrimental effect on investors. What would it look like? I think it would look something like this. You have a complete inability of anyone who isn't incredibly wealthy to be able to bring an individual case. And the reason is that all lawsuits are expensive, but securities lawsuits where you have to have experts and you have to prove through essentially various economists that the misrepresentations that the company made contributed to your investment loss. That's a very, very expensive lawsuit, which then means you are only going to have the very wealthy individuals or businesses versus the very wealthy companies, which I think everyone might agree that if you take a look at the last several commercial cases before the Supreme Court, is exactly where this court has led essentially consumers in every type of case.
Well, and securities litigation is one that is really starting to boom right now, because we do have lots of instances of financial fraud. The market crashes in 2007, 2008 were essentially brought about by just massive fraud from all sectors. So this is a logical place for our corporate court to come in and say, okay, well, we're going to use these security cases to go in and dismantle these class actions. And as you just pointed out, it's going to make it to where individuals cannot bring a case because they cannot afford to go hire an attorney. Whereas when we have class actions, you know very well, they can call and they become a part of the group. They don't have to pay anything. They wait for the verdict and then they can get compensation out of it. They don't have to go out and find somebody on their own and pay for it on their own every step of the way.
No, you're absolutely right.
And a large part of that is the court and the Republican effort to just defund the trial lawyers. That's been going on for decades now, and I think this is an extension of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is, if you want to look at it, Halliburton's place in the Chamber of Commerce is pretty well entrenched, and this case, the one that they are trying to get the Supreme Court to look at, is very much, you could look at just in the continuum over the last couple years with Walmart, Amex, Amgen, Comcast. These were all cases that this Supreme Court said, we really are going to make this very, very, very hard for class actions. And including that there is nothing wrong with, in contracts between any type of customer and any type of engagement, that you can have class action waivers, which means that even if this were a decision of contract, I want to buy a car, auto dealer wants to sell me a car. If something's wrong, they say, okay, 1, you got to go to arbitration, and 2, in arbitration, you can't have a class action. Basically, you've gotten class actions off the table for good. While it clearly is going to be bad for individuals, I think that this may be a little bit of buyer's remorse on the part of the chamber, because what may happen is if the Supreme Court says we were wrong in Basic v. Levinson 25 years ago, and securities class actions are going to be very, very hard to bring, if not impossible, you are going to have a rash of individual lawsuits. So the same business that wants to get away from a class action is going to be fighting in forums and venues across the country, both courts and arbitration. I'm not sure that a business wants that. If they want peace, they want it once. They don't want to keep fighting.
Right.
So I think it will be interesting to see if they actually get what they want, whether they're happy when they see what the results are.
Right. It's something that could easily backfire on them. But unfortunately, Matt, we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com, on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.
Hi, I'm Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire on Free Speech TV. The corporate-controlled media rakes in millions of dollars in profit every year by only telling you half of the story. They're at the mercy of their corporate sponsors, and they refuse to take on corporations that kill, maim, and harm consumers. Here at Free Speech TV, we don't have shareholders. We don't answer to corporate America, and we don't pull any punches. Our loyalty is to the viewers, and our viewers are the ones that help keep Free Speech TV alive. Free Speech TV doesn't take corporate money, and that's why your financial support is so important to us. Viewer voices, not corporate sponsors, fuel Free Speech TV and drive many of our programming decisions. You can help protect Free Speech TV with your donation. Free Speech TV airs independent news and views for independent thinkers like you. Our people-powered programs demonstrate what's possible in our democracy when we unite as workers, as students, as artists, as parents, and partners in progress. More people means more power. Each donation brings more power in programs and more possibilities for change. Our programming equips viewers with vital tools, resources, contacts, and examples of how to collectively build alternative, sustainable solutions to serious community problems. Please donate now and bring these organizing tools into your community. Everyone should have access to news and information that's forming the world around them. Our goal is to keep you and everybody involved. We aim to reach every viewer possible because we're all in this together. Go online to freespeech.org and help support independent, honest news journalism. Your support helps keep information flowing, and together we can hold the corporate media more accountable.